Good afternoon, just into good afternoon. Welcome everybody to this webinar. Will, if you'll just change the slide, please, next slide. That tells you who I am. I'm Jill Coverdale and I'm the Royal College of Nursing Head of Education. I'm delighted to be chairing this event. Just to make you aware, I am a school nurse, SCPHN. I had the first 20 years of my career either in practice or delivering programmes in Leeds. So it's still an area that's very close to my heart. So I'm delighted to be chairing this session today. Thank you for joining us all. We had over 700 people register for this, so that is a really good number of people who are very, very interested, obviously, in this important topic. We have set aside 90 minutes, but we know that this will fly by. We will hear from the RCN Chief Nurse, Professor Nicola Ranger, and Matthew McClelland, the Executive Director of Strategy and Insight at the NMC, and Anne Trotter, Assistant Director of Professional Practice at the NMC. So we're very, very fortunate. We will then facilitate a question and answer session. And we will also we've got some questions that you've sent in advance, and that's lovely. Thank you very much. But then please do put your comments and questions in the chat, and then we'll be able to facilitate those questions. At the end of the session, my colleague Jane Beach will, from Unite, will be summarising the session we've had today, and will also provide you with a poll that you can evaluate with. I'm just about to pop you into a poll now, because we'd like to know who we have at the webinar in terms of which professional group you are from. So if we have the next slide then, Will, and if people will go onto that, you'll find yourself on a web page, and you can tell us from which professional group you are in. And then if you submit that, my colleague Michelle from the RCN will show us who we have in the room. Whilst you're doing that, I would like to just say some thank yous to the working group. It's been an absolute privilege to work with the different professional organisations that we have involved in today, but especially to Dr. Karen Whitaker from Institute Health Visiting, because she's really kind of corralled us all together, and also to Michelle Mosley from the RCN who's organised this webinar. But I'm also delighted to be here together with colleagues Georgina and Amanda from Health Visiting, Sally Ann from School Nursing, and Christina from OK Health Nursing, and Michelle, hopefully, who's come in from the Royal College of Midwives. So what are we seeing here? Let's have a look at our poll. It's still kind of going. So if we go up a little bit, we've got 26% school nursing, 56% health visiting, 8% from OK Health Nursing. We've got some student SCPHNs, welcome. At the moment, we've not got any midwives, but hopefully that will increase. And we've got some registered nurses and student nurses. So yes, we've got some midwives coming in. So that's fabulous. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. We also wanted to know what your kind of knowledge of regulatory reform and regulatory review processes were before we started the session, and then we'll ask you again at the end. So that's interesting. Most people have got a little bit of knowledge, so that's good, and this will definitely increase that knowledge and give you an opportunity to ask some questions as well. Okay then, right, well, if we can go on to the next slide then, Will. And we will that's just to remind you who we have collaborating on this event, which is an excellent way of working. And then the next slide, and I'd like to introduce the RCN Chief Nurse, Professor Nicola Ranger, who's going to do a little bit of an introduction for us to the session today. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you very, very much, Jill, and thanks so much for the opportunity to welcome you all to this event. I certainly wish that I could stay for the entire event, but Jill will feed back to me how it's gone. As Jill put on the slide, this is an event that's been done in collaboration with some of our key partners, which is absolutely brilliant. And huge thanks to the NMC, who will be leading a great deal of this event as we consider the implications of the NMC regulatory review, particularly focusing on specialist community public health and health visitors, school nurses, occupational health nurses, and midwives and others that are certainly listed here today. I hope it'll be a good event for you. The reason that I can't stay today is because I've got to go and have a conversation with Newsnight about the real challenges that the NHS is currently under, as we all know. But whatever way we come to sort things out and to review things and to get things better, the key to success for patients and children and others are those of you that are on the screen and visiting this webinar, because you're absolutely the key to success. So I very, very much hope that you're going to have an interesting event, and I know that it gives you the opportunity to really think about the future. So without me whittering on anymore, I just want to say I have a fantastic webinar today, and I look forward to hearing the outcome. Thank you very much, Jill and team.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you very much indeed. And next, I would like to introduce Matthew McClelland. And Matthew, as I said, is Executive Director of Strategy and Insight at the NMC. Thank you very much, Matthew, for coming along today. We're very, very grateful. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Jill and Nicola, for that introduction. Just before I start, I'm going to try and share my screen. So hopefully you can see now the slides that I'm planning to talk about. Thank you very much again for inviting me and for that introduction, Jill and Nicola. I couldn't agree more with what Nicola just said, actually, about the fact that the key to success of NHS and social care is the people that work within it, and that's all of you on this call, and the other 808,000 people on the NMC register all around the UK. So a huge thank you to all of you for everything that you do every day. My name is Matthew, and I'm Executive Director of Strategy and Insight. I'm also the lead for our regulatory reform programme, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by somebody who probably needs no introduction to most of you, Anne Trotter, who's our fantastic Assistant Director of Professional Practice, who is just such an expert in all things to do with our standards and the way that we regulate. And Anne is going to be talking to you shortly. What I thought I would do is talk a bit about why we need regulatory reform, what that entails, and some of the implications for SCPHN and SPQ colleagues on our register, and some of the changes that will entail when we get into regulatory reform. So why do we need regulatory reform? Well, we've broadly had the same legislation at the Nursing and Midwifery Council since we were set up in 2001. In fact, there's a little fun fact that I like sharing with colleagues, which is when the NMC's legislation came into effect, Gareth Gates was #1 in the charts. Now, if anybody can remember Gareth Gates, that will give you a sense of how long ago it was that the NMC's legislation was introduced. And now, of course, there have been changes and updates to that in the intervening 22 years. But it remains fundamentally as it did all those years ago. And part of the challenge we have as a regulator is that every time we want to change something in our legislation, we have to go back through quite a long and complicated parliamentary process. And if you cast your minds back to when Gareth Gates was in the charts, I suspect health and social care looks very different, and the roles that people were performing looks very different. And the fact that we've still got the same legislation 20 years on means that it's increasingly difficult for us to keep pace with the change in the sector, to support all of the people on our register, to do the roles that you do brilliantly every single day without changes to the powers and the legislation that we have. So just a quick note on some of the terminology. So we talk a lot about our legislation, and in fact our legislation is in two parts. So there's the order, and then there are the rules. And the order is set by the Department for Health and Social Care. We are a 4-country regulator, and the Department of Health and Social Care owns the legislation across the 4 nations, and it works very closely with the governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to do that. But it is owned by the Department of Health and Social Care. And beneath that, can I just check? Sorry, I've had a little note to say the slides are not visible. Is that the case?
I can certainly see them, Will. Matthew, Will, is there a problem? Any problem? He can see them. We'll certainly share the slides afterwards. I think carry on, Matthew, and we'll work in the background on those, please. Thank you.
Sorry to pause midstream, but I just thought if they weren't visible to people, I'd just get that sorted out straight away. So the order, as I was saying, is owned by the Department of Health and Social Care and agreed by Parliament. And that's the overarching legislation that we have as an organisation. That sets out what we're here for, how we're structured, and what we have to do. And one of the things that the order currently allows us to do is to make rules, and the rules are the next level down from the order, and they explain more about how we will deliver on our functions. But although the order currently allows us to make those rules, it also requires them to be signed off by Parliament. So what that means is that all the detail of what is in our legislation to go through a parliamentary approval process, and that takes quite some time. And that will be one of the things that we're hoping will change through the reform programme. Now, the regulatory reform work is cross-regulatory. So the Department of Health and Social Care is leading on this for all the regulators of health professions, and it's been going on for a little while. It kicked off in the summer of 2021 with a consultation that the department ran, and at that point we started talking to stakeholders about what that might entail. And the first serious bit of reform that has happened has been the introduction of the AAPA, the Anaesthesia Associates and Physicians Associates legislation, which is for the GMC. And that came into effect in March of this year. We've worked closely with the department and with the GMC and other regulators to help shape that, because what the department have said is that it wants a consistent set of legislation across regulators. So what it's introduced for the GMC around anaesthesia associates and physicians associates ultimately will form the basis of what it introduces across all of health professions, but with relevant changes to make sure that it works for the different professions. So here we are now in spring. It does actually feel a bit more like spring today than it did yesterday, but here we are in spring 2024, and what we are doing is working through the timescales for the reform of the NMC's legislation, with a view then to that being consulted on in 2025 and started to be implemented from 2026 onwards. So what are we trying to achieve with regulatory reform? The things listed on this slide are what we're really aiming for. We would like to have a register of professionals that's really clear and easy for people to understand. And really what we mean here is that it's easy for the public to understand. And that probably means reflecting the primary registration that people have, but also what regulated post-registration qualifications that they hold and are currently using in their practice. And we think that is clear for members of the public, that when they come and look at our register, they can see what's somebody's primary registration and what are the regulated post-registration qualifications that they're currently using. So that's the first one. Secondly, we'd like to strengthen the way we do quality assurance of nursing and midwifery education programs. At the moment, we have around about 1,000 qualifications approved all around the UK, but we only have a binary choice around quality assurance of education. So we can approve them or we can unapprove them. And when we're dealing with the variety of risks that crop up in health and social care, that binary choice isn't always enough to meet the risks. So what we'd like is a bit more of a sophisticated way that we can take action, perhaps by imposing conditions if we see risks in an education programme which need to be mitigated but doesn't require the removal of the programme altogether. We will also have, we hope, the power to charge for quality assurance of education. We think this is really important because at the moment, all of our regulation is funded, of course, through registration fees. But actually having the ability to charge for quality assurance of regulation would enable us to generate income from universities in order to fund that aspect of how we do our work. We'd also like to make it easier to stop people from using misleading role titles. At the moment, we have protected titles around registered nurse, around midwife, around nursing associate, and around SCPHN. But we will be thinking about what the titles are that we need to protect in the future so that we can prevent people from using role titles that are confusing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I'm just going to unshare and reshare my screen in the hope that that will solve the difficulty with the slides. Hopefully that is now working. The fourth area is that we'd like to get quicker at the way we deal with fitness to practice decisions, and at the moment in particular we have a bit of a backlog which we're working as hard as we can to resolve, because we really understand the impacts that delays in fitness to practice have on people on our register and on the public. But regulatory reform will enable us to do more and to be faster and fairer and more people-centred in the way we do the work. So hopefully that will assist. And the final area of being able to adapt the way we regulate in the future seems to be it's something that I've already touched on already, which is this need for us to be able to respond to changes in the external environment by changing our legislation without the need to go through Parliament in all cases. So what are we doing? What are our areas of priority for the new register in particular? And I know this will be particularly important for colleagues on this call, because what you'd like to reflect on is the impacts on registration, particularly of post-registration qualifications. Now, what we are absolutely going to continue doing, and we have committed to doing, is continuing to regulate and set standards for post-registration qualifications. We will also, as you know, we've started the work to look at regulating and setting standards for advanced practice. We're also going to be looking alongside that at how we make sure that across all of the post-registration qualifications, people have the opportunities to demonstrate how they're keeping up to date through revalidation. And then these final two areas, which are extremely important, we will be looking at how we protect titles. So nurse, which is currently not protected, health visitor, which is also not protected in that way, and how we protect all our qualifications with the objective that people cannot use job titles which are confusing for the public, which create the impression that people have qualifications they don't hold or are in regulated roles when they are not. And those are really important issues that we want to look at. So just explaining those in a little bit more detail before I hand over to Anne. So at the moment, as I said before, we don't protect the title nurse. We protect the title registered nurse, and we protect the title midwife and a registered specialist community public health nurse. And in England, we protect the title nursing associate. And what that means is that if somebody uses one of those titles when they're not entered on the register as having one of those, having the necessary registration, then they are technically committing a criminal offence, and that is something where we could take action ourselves or refer to other organisations to take action. But there is, we know, a risk that job titles are proliferating. People are using nurse on its own in all sorts of different ways, and we think that needs to change. And there's pretty strong support, we think, across the public for this, and a very strong support we know from a registrant community, some of whom have been really actively engaged in the Protect Nurse campaign. So we really support change on this. And we have asked the Department of Health and Social Care to change the protected title from registered nurse to nurse. Only the department can make that change, but we would like them to do that. It will come, we suspect, with some legal carve-outs, because there are other regulated professions which validly use the title nurse, say veterinary nurses and dental nurses, who are subject to their own regulated systems. We would not want to interfere with that. But what it will mean, we think, is a process of transition where people who are using the word nurse in their job title but are not on our register, those that will need to flow out of the system as we introduce the new protected title. And we'd very much welcome views. It won't be impact free on people, and it won't be impact free on organisations. So we very much welcome views on that process and how we go about transitioning. So health visitor is not currently a protected title. As I say, we currently protect the title SCPHN. We would propose not doing that in the future, because what we have detected is that not many people use that title in their day-to-day work. But what we would like to do is to protect the title health visitor, because we will be protecting the word nurse on its own and in combination with other words. So that means that anybody who's calling themselves a nurse, whether it's a public health nurse, a community nurse, an occupational health nurse, will get some degree of protection from the nurse title. But health visitor is something which falls out with the other titles on the register. And we think, therefore, in order to be clear with the public, health visitors should be protected, and that way it's clear for the public that a health visitor is a regulated profession. We would, alongside this, want to protect all of our qualifications. And so what we've asked the department to do is to make sure that we have the ability to say that where we have set any post-registration qualification, we need to be able to stop people from giving the impression that they hold a qualification that they don't, by using a confusing job title. So, for example, where we've set occupational health nursing as a post-registration qualification, or school nursing as a post-registration qualification, then the qualification protection powers would enable us to say, you can't call yourself a school nurse if you don't have the school nursing qualification, because it's creating the impression that you hold a qualification that you don't actually hold. And we would expect to be able to do that for all of our post-registration qualifications. So again, we'd very much welcome views on this proposal and about how we go through the transition and impact around that. So finally, just a graphic representation of what our register we expect will look like after regulatory reform. So we are expecting to have 3 direct entry parts to the register: nurse, midwife and nursing associate. We will continue under the nursing part to record on the register the fields that people had at the point that they joined the register. And alongside that, then we will be recording and setting standards for all the post-registration qualifications that we currently do. And I've tried to illustrate those on the right-hand side of the screen. And those former post-registration qualifications where we've had standards in the past but no longer do, we will continue also to reflect those on the register, but we won't be setting standards for those. So that's what the register will look like in the future. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Anne. I think I've overrun Anne by 1 minute, but I will carry on being the driver for your slides. So over to you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Anne Trotter. I'm Assistant Director within Professional Practice Directorate at the NMC. It's lovely to be speaking to so many of you, and I look forward to the questions. So I'm just going to cover in a few slides some of those wider considerations for those of you that are have SCPHN qualifications now, and those of you that are aspiring specialist community public health nurses, so that we can look at any impacts or considerations. So next slide, please, Matthew. So as colleagues will know, in 2022, we published new specialist community public health nurse standards of proficiency, and we identified these in specific fields of SCPHN practice. So there is the SCPHN health visitor, school nurse, occupational health nurse, and then we retained the more broad public health nurse qualification in recognition of the need for certain parts of our community and populations who would not naturally fall into those other 3 categories. Obviously, within these standards, there is an option to also become an independent supplementary prescriber. And we also publish new standards for post-registration programs, and that includes post-registration programs for those students entering to become a SCPHN qualified professional, and also those professionals entering to become a community nurse with a specialist practice qualification. So all of these things were undertaken after 2.5 years of engagement and public consultation, and as I say, we published them in 2022. Just to make the point in relation to the post-registration programme standards, Standard 1.1, which sits in the programme standards, which is very much about recruitment and selection, we received some notification that people were reading the wording of that in a very literal way, and what that meant is for certain parts of the country who wanted to attract students who are about to qualify, or students who were qualified but didn't yet have their NMC PIN, were unable to commence that programme. So the wording is being amended, and we're publishing that updated standard tomorrow, as Council agreed that at their meeting in March. There was no need to consult on this publicly, because we had never changed the intention of this standard, which was to make sure that when someone commenced their SCPHN programme or their community nursing SPQ, that they were on the register already and had the necessary PIN as a registered nurse level 1 qualification or as a midwife. Next slide, please. So in terms of what happens now, all the arrangements that we know to be in place are the same arrangements that will carry on for now. So what Matthew has indicated is that the plans, and some of those plans are timelines influenced by the Department of Health and Social Care. And once we know what those timelines are, then that will influence the timeline we will go on in relation to the things that we will be consulting on through regulatory reform. So what that means is that specialist community public health nursing students who are on current programmes. So that will be a programme against the older standards. They can complete the approved programme they have started. And there might be one or two SCPHN programmes who've already started against the 2022 standards, they too can complete what they started, as everyone can. But any new programme that starts from the 1st of September 2024, so that's in a few months' time, must be approved against the 2022 SCPHN standards. So those students will identify whether they're entering the programme within the health visitor, the school nurse, the occupational health, or the public health nurse route. And that has to be very clearly said, because as you know, one of the major differences from the new SCPHN standards as opposed to the previous SCPHN standards, that there are field-specific standards in addition to the core standards that every student must meet. So from September 24, anyone enrolling onto a new programme to undertake a SCPHN qualification must be against the new standards. And that is the same for the community nursing SPQs. Obviously, SCPHN students will successfully complete their programme, and in the way that approved education institutions upload that information to the NMC now, that will continue. Nothing has changed. So everything carries on as it has been before and will continue to be now, until such times anything the NMC wants to say by way of updating that. Next slide, please. So then, thinking about your professional journey, you are all professionals, you're nurses or you're midwives, or you're both a nurse and a midwife, and you're moving forward to register your qualification. So once you've successfully completed your SCPHN programme individually, because I see that there are some students in the audience, your university will upload the details to indicate that you have been successful in meeting the programme outcomes that meet our standards, and you will then make the application to register your qualification as a SCPHN. A small sum of money will be exchanged for this, and your registration will then indicate in your individual PIN that you are with your qualification. So as Matthew said, your primary qualification is that you will be a registered nurse level 1 and a midwife, or registered nurse or a midwife, in order to complete the qualification. And then that will be identified on your PIN. So if you look at your PIN over the next forthcoming months, nothing changes in relation to the timeline that Matthew has outlined. So you'll be able to see your SCPHN qualification, and you will be able to identify the field of practice. And importantly, should a member of the public want to do so, even though the protected title is Specialist Community Public Health Nurse, rather than School Nurse or Health Visitor or Occupational Health Nurse, that is visible in the ways it's visible today. And then when it comes to those, for colleagues who want to revalidate, as we all know, this is a 3-year cycle, so we're all at different points in that 3-year cycle. You will continue to revalidate in line with the code and the relevant standards, and we are suggesting that you can start using the 2022 SCPHN standards as part of your revalidation in line with your own scope of practice. So some of you may be practicing as health visitors or as school nurses or as occupational health nurses, and some of you may have moved into leadership or policy or education roles, or like me, working for the NMC. So you can use the code and you can use the relevant post-registration standards, as well as you think about your own CPD, as you think about your reflections on your practice, and when you're looking for that feedback. And the public will continue to confirm an individual's Specialist Community Public Health Nurse qualification. So again, this comes back to Matthew's point that this is not a title that professionals use when introducing themselves to members of the public, nor it is a title that the public may be very familiar with. And this is certainly something we found when we were doing the post-registration review, when we were engaging with members of the public, they would understand who their health visitor was. Some of them understood who their school nurse was, or who their occupational health nurse was, but they did not recognise a specialist community public health nurse qualification. But in the way that the register shows it just now, it will continue to show that. Next slide, please. So just wanted to remind colleagues, and Matthew mentioned it, our council, it was a very seminal moment in March. Our council took the decision based on all the evidence that was put forward by the advanced practice team, that additional regulation of advanced practice is needed. So currently, anyone who is in an advanced practice role is regulated in relation to their qualification, their primary registration as a nurse or a midwife. And what the council have agreed, that additional regulation of advanced practice is needed. And they have agreed that we could proceed to phase 2 of the review. And the council also agreed to a series of approaches. So we will develop standards of proficiency for advanced level practice and the associated programme standards. Sorry, that word has dropped off there. So there will be standards of proficiency, what people need to know and be able to do in relation to advanced level practice, and the associated programme standards that support the education and training and the student journey for those aspiring to becoming advanced nurse practitioners and advanced midwife practitioners. We are doing it for both professions. The council also agreed that we would go forward to adopt a collaborative approach to develop a UK-wide advanced practice framework. And where possible, we will incorporate either a shared position with other professional regulators or a definition of advanced level practice. At the moment, we know that each of the 4 countries has their own advanced practice framework. And although they're broadly similar, there are significant differences in some parts of those frameworks. So we will be looking to unify those in collaboration with colleagues across the 4 countries. And then, as colleagues will know, we have committed to undertaking a review of revalidation guidance and the code, and that's scheduled for 2025. And by that time, the code will be 10 years in action. And there are clearly things that has changed over those 10 years. But Matthew, I've got no idea who was number 1 in 10 years ago in 2015. I'm impressed by your knowledge. So for this audience, what you need to be thinking about, and to give an example, the Institute for Health Visiting had published their career frameworks, where they were looking at the career framework for people in specialist community public health nurse, health visitor roles, and those who were new to those roles, those who were experienced specialist practitioners, and those who were moving into advanced and consultant level practice. Next slide, please. So this audience really needs to think about that in relation to their own workforce and their own individual qualification. I wanted to mention, while I could, that there is a review of nursing and midwifery practice learning taking place, and that's just kicked off. And that is its focus and the scope of that is pre-registration. So it's pre-registration nurses, students, midwifery students, and nursing associates in England students. And we're looking at practice learning and the quality of that practice learning. And although it doesn't include, the scope does not include students who are qualified professionals who are studying to become a specialist community public health nurse, we know that student nurses and student midwives and student nursing associates can and probably should undertake a placement, at least one, if not more, in a public health learning environment. So the independent research will be looking at that as well. We have commissioned the Nuffield Trust to undertake the independent research on our behalf. And what they will be looking at is that they'll consider what contributes to effective practice learning, looking at models across the United Kingdom, but also outside of the United Kingdom. We want to be able to explain why some countries have their programmes that are different and what is the factors that facilitate that. So, for example, in Australia, we know that nursing programmes are shorter in duration, but there is a very different clinical education infrastructure within the practice learning environment to what happens in the United Kingdom. We want Nuffield Trust will be speaking to stakeholders across the United Kingdom, and that includes specialist community public health nurses who support pre-registration learning. And that will be looking at professionals, it will be looking at members of the public and anyone who uses services, and across the NHS and health and social care. And there is a link there to how you can get involved and how you can join that community of interest. Next slide, please, Matthew. So this is the last slide before we start to listen to lots of questions that you will have. In the top box is a reminder, as Matthew said, in terms of next steps, the Department of Health and Social Care will consult on the nursing midwifery order, and that will begin in 2025. And the new legislation will come into force in 2026. And following that, the timelines for all of this is that we will consult on our rules. So you can see that timeline, that the qualification you have now still has currency, will continue to have currency, and the ways of working that people are educated, who register and who revalidate will continue. But there are wider impacts, be that on practice learning, be that on the advent of additional regulation for advanced practice. And so we've got just some links there for you. I know these slides are going to be shared. So there's links to the work we're doing in regulatory reform. There's links to post-registration, and although there's more links available, this is taking you to the frequently asked questions in relation to our post-registration standards. And then there's the link to the advanced practice review, as I mentioned, because that will and should involve people with post-registration qualifications who may decide that they are either working at advanced practice level or consultant practice level. So thank you very much. I think we're handing back to you, Jill, in relation to questions.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you also, Matthew. Yes, we are going to now start some questions. Jane from Unite will ask some of the generic questions, and then each of these specialist areas will ask theirs. Just one question I have before we move on to that, if I may, Jane. Matthew, you talked about people giving you their views on protecting the title. Will that come out formally, or if not, if you just want people to comment, where should they send their thoughts, or will we be asked as registrants our views in a formal way? That's one question from myself.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So we've been holding a number of events like this where we've been gathering views, smaller events as well. We will continue to do that. The formal moments where people will be asked will be as part of the consultation processes, which Anne outlined on her final slide, which is the department's consultation in 2025 and then the NMC's consultation on rules that will follow on from that probably in 2026.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, Jane, I'll hand over to you. You've got, I think we've got 2 or 3 generic questions, haven't we? And then we'll move on to the particular groups. Thank you.
Yes, we had quite a few questions submitted beforehand, and we've had a few more on the chat. So I've tried to look at those that have been answered, but I think this one really is for you, Anne. What plans will be in place to ensure SCPHN standards for practice and education are reviewed and updated in the future?
Thank you, Jane. And I realise where the heart of that question has come from, because we took a very long time to review the old standards, as we all know, and we won't repeat history on that one, that's for sure. And I think what we've demonstrated is that by reviewing the wording of standard 1.1, that we've said, okay, people are maybe not interpreting that in the way we thought, let's review it. So we're moving more towards those kind of consequential continuous improvement changes. But if it's a root and branch review of standards of proficiency or education and training standards, we would want to do that in a much more regular fashion. We certainly wouldn't want to wait as long as we did in relation to the last ones.
Brilliant, thank you. Another one, I'm going to put these two together. So in the event of the closure of the SCPHN part of the register, what will happen to the current protected title of SCPHN, and how will post-registration SCPHN qualifications and field of practice be noted as current on the register? So I don't know who fancies that one. That would be you, Matthew.
Yeah, so shall I take that one? Because I mean, I think there's quite a lot to unpack in that, particularly this sort of closure of the third part of the register, which you know, sort of right in a very narrow technical sense. At the moment, there's a part of the register that says SCPHN. In the future, there'll be parts of the register that say nurse, midwife, nursing associate, and the SCPHN qualifications will all be managed as post-registration qualifications. But I wouldn't want people to run away with the idea that that means SCPHNs are disappearing or qualifications are disappearing or anything like that. It really is a technical change to the way in which things are noted on the register. So the SCPHN title, which is currently protected, which means it's a criminal offence to call yourself a SCPHN if you're not a SCPHN, that will disappear. So in theory, anybody could call themselves a SCPHN, except that it would then engage one of our other protected titles, because you'd then be calling yourself a nurse. So in fact, really nothing changes. What we will be encouraging people to do is to make sure that they are calling themselves meaningful titles that reflect the qualifications that they hold, because that's really what we're trying to achieve here. I mean, I've used this example with some of you before, so forgive me for repeating it, but the Hello, My Name Is campaign, which has been so powerful, is amazing, because it's so important to patients that they make that human connection and know the name of the person that is caring for them. In my view, it needs to go just one step further, which is, hello, my name is, and I am a, because I know from my own experiences of care, my own experiences of taking my elderly mum for care, it isn't at all clear. It's often very clear that the person is called Jane or Matthew or Anne or Jill or whatever, but it's very unclear what their role is and what they're qualified and empowered to do. And what we're trying to do is use the powers that we've got to be really, really clear that actually people should be using job titles that reflect the qualifications that they have. And it should be clear for the people receiving care when that's happening. That's what we're trying to get to. So specifically on your question, SCPHNs will still exist, but we won't be calling them SCPHNs. We'll be calling them by the what currently the fields. They'll be registered as post-registration qualifications, and we would expect that only people who hold those qualifications will use job titles that reflect those qualifications.
And one that follows on from that, Jill, do tell me if you want to stop, because there's a lot of generic ones coming through, is around practitioners that are dual registered, so school nurse and health visitor. You know, how would, you know, what will happen there, particularly if health visitor is a protected title? Will school nurse also be, and how will that work?
So, I mean, what would show on the register if you're a school nurse and a health visitor would be your primary registration, which could be nurse or midwife, plus then the fact that you've got a qualification in health visiting and a qualification in school nursing. You would be, you would be allowed, as a person holding all of those qualifications, to call yourself a midwife or a nurse, because that's your primary qualification. But because you hold those additional qualifications, you would also be able to say, I'm a health visitor, and you'd also be able to say, I'm a school nurse, without engaging any of the protection powers that exist in our legislation. So again, it would be very much up to the individual. What's the clearest thing to do in the care situation that I'm in? Am I acting here as a midwife? Am I acting here as a school nurse? Am I acting here as a health visitor? And then you introduce yourself and you call yourself by whatever is the relevant title in those in that environment would be my advice.
If I hold you there then, Jane, and we'll move on to our health visiting colleagues, Amanda or Georgina, do you want to ask 2 health visiting specific questions?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jill. Just adding for what Matthew was saying there, just some extra clarity really, because I think there's been a lot of questions coming through. Would there be a separate register for health visitors in the same way that there is for midwives?
So there's only one register at the moment, and that will be the same in the future. It's the NMC register that records all the people who are eligible to practice in the UK as a nurse, midwife, a nursing associate, or who hold the additional qualifications. And that will be the slight change at the moment. Instead of SCPHN being a part of the register, it will be an additional qualification, but it will all be recorded on the register in the same way. So Georgina, on the assumption that you're a health visitor, somebody would still go onto the register, type your name in, you'd come up and it would show your primary qualification plus the fact that you've got a qualification as a health visitor.
Great, thank you. I've got another one, Jill, if that's
Mm-hmm.
okay.
Yeah.
There's just been a few around practice teaching, actually. And again, this might be another one for Matthew. So the qualification of practice teacher prepares professionals to support SCPHN students at a level above the preparation of practice assessors and practice supervisors, which is important now all SCPHN programmes prepare for students at level 7. So what will the recording of this look like, and will this be protected too?
Actually going to ask Anne, who I think has a recorded qualification as a teacher, to pick this one up.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question, Georgina. As you know, the NMC no longer set standards for practice teacher qualification or the teacher qualification. And historically, we didn't record the practice teacher qualification on the NMC register on any individual's PIN. We only recorded the teacher qualification, or the older version, which I have, which back in the day was a registered nurse tutor, for those of you who remember that, and is now a recorded qualification lecturer / practice educator. So for those people that have those qualifications just now, they're still visible on the register. And as part of the future work on regulatory reform, looking at what's on the register, a decision will be taken, so that if people have those qualifications now, as in a teacher qualification or a more historical lecturer, practice educator qualification, they are still able to see them. But because we no longer set those standards, it's unlikely that any future professional will have those on, and that's been the case for the last couple of years already.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
Thank you, Georgina. I will come back to you. I'll keep going round if I can.
Perfect. No worries.
Sally Ann, have you got some school nursing specific questions?
Yeah, I've tried to group and reword some, because as conversations are happening, sort of questions are just changing in nature. So I guess this one's a clarification one. So if the NMC proposals aren't protecting the title school nurse, or that's what we think we've heard, however, the proposals seem to be suggesting that only a nurse holding a SCPHN school nurse qualification will be able to call themselves, have a title school nurse. Is that correct? And if somebody that didn't have the SCPHN qualification as a school nurse titled themselves school nurse, would there be an implication for that?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a really important question, and there's sometimes a bit of confusion between protected titles, what that entails, and protected qualifications, and what that entails, which is why sometimes I try and avoid talking about them in those terms, because I think that leads to confusion. I think that the bottom line is, if we've set a qualification in school nursing, which we currently have, in the future we want to have the power to be able to say, if you don't have the school nursing qualification, you cannot call yourself a school nurse. And that will come through the qualification protection, sitting alongside the title protection. But the easiest way to think of it is, if we've set a qualification, so we're regulating a qualification, then people won't be able to, or we want the power for people not to be able to use job titles that create the impression that they have that qualification if they don't. So school nursing qualification exists. You ought to have that school nursing qualification in order to call yourself a school nurse.
Okay, and I guess a bit of a follow-up one that people have asked in the chat is that if somebody therefore is not a SCPHN qualified school nurse, but currently practicing using the title, and this does happen in some areas, will they no longer be able to use that title, school nurse? I'm guessing the answer is no, they won't. But
yeah, and that's absolutely what we're aiming for, because we've heard what you've described across school nursing, but also across a number of the other specialist qualifications, that there are people using titles that give the impression that, or using job titles that give the impression they have a specialist qualification when actually they don't. And so where we'd like to get to is to have the power to say that needs to stop. But we do recognise that will have an impact, and there'll need to be a process and a kind of transition. What we don't want to do is create on day one a situation where, you know, many thousands of people find themselves potentially at risk. So what we would want to do is to work very closely with employers, because they're going to be key in this, but also with individuals, so that over a period of time we get to a place where only people who have the specialist qualifications are using those titles in practice. But it will take a bit of it'll take a bit of partnership working across the system to make that happen.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. And I think, you know, this webinar's an ideal time for people to learn something and then start to go back and discuss it with employers as well, and in professional groups. Lovely, thank you, Sally, and I'll come back to you. I'd like to ask Christina if there are any occupational health nursing questions that you'd like to ask. Questions on?
Yeah, of course, these are similar to our other colleagues who are in the other fields as well, which is very much that there are a number of specialist courses within occupational health nursing which are outside of the NMC SCPHN course, and as a faculty we recognise some of those courses and issued a statement last year saying these are previous courses which we were thought were either taught at SCPHN standard or another piece of work we did with Public Health England about what we thought the education of occupational health nurses was, and we tried to clarify this thing around titles so that those that are occupational health nurses do have qualifications, but not just the SCPHN approved or the NMC approved courses. And it causes a huge amount of confusion because their employers are not the NMC, not the NHS usually, and we want to make sure that those that are commissioning occupational health services recognise them, because titles, you're trying to protect safety, but in order to protect safety we need to make sure people are competent, and we've assessed competence through our accreditation scheme and the set of competencies we've done, and it'll be a shame that after all that work the faculty's done to support nurses who've got great skills, that they're going to be said that they are null and void.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really important question. And Anne, I don't know whether you want to comment from the standards perspective, because it is possible, isn't it, to recognise qualifications that were not originally awarded as NMC approved ones.
Absolutely. Christina, you know this is a tricky area. It continues to be a tricky area because I think there are SCPHN occupational health nurses, and then there are nurses who work in occupational health, and those nurses who work in occupational health may have done a myriad of different qualifications, be highly experienced, and have a very significant knowledge base, and that's true for school nursing too. But we don't recognise those qualifications because those qualifications either might have closely aligned to the NMC standards, but the NMC were not involved in the approval of the programme in any way, shape or form. Now, what's different to the 2022 standards from the previous standards that were published is that there was, there was a slight recognition of prior learning, but every assessment had to be undertaken, as you know. So in effect, it meant that everyone had to do an entire SCPHN occupational health nursing programme alongside the qualification they had. Now there is opportunity for recognition of prior learning, and that would be through a formal submission to an approved education institution organisation. Now, I accept that some individuals may not want to do that, but that route is possible. We've made that possible and reduced any regulatory barrier that was in place previously.
Good.
Have you got another question, Christina?
Most of them around that, just recognising nurses that have got a huge amount of knowledge and skills and competence. And if the NMC aren't recognising them, then we fall into issues around the HSE also recognising nurses that aren't SCPHN OH as well. And there's very few occupational nurses for work that's there.
Sorry, Christina,
qualified.
You are breaking up, but I think we've got the message. Very, what your members are concerned about. So, thank you for that. Thank you. It's broken up a little bit. Have we got questions from our colleagues from the Q&I? I was thinking there might be some in terms of SPQ. Agnes?
Sorry, I'm just coming off mute. No, I think obviously really important to keep in the word nurse, obviously. And I think probably lots of the questions have been asked about the, the fact that the health visitors are not going to be a separate recorded, as it were, but they're going to be under the post qualifying. I think that's really important that they're recognised, that they continue to be recognised. Yeah, and I think it's probably quite a positive move forward that what Matthew's clearly stated, that people cannot call themselves a school nurse if they are not a school nurse. And I think that we're seeing this in the community a great deal, across all of the disciplines. They go and say, hello, I'm a district nurse. Actually, they're not. They haven't done the qualification. Hello, I'm a school nurse, and they haven't done the qualification. So I actually think that the Queen's Nursing Institute, will really support that. I think that's, I think too many people are going under the umbrella of a title, and they really haven't got those additional skills. And we need these additional programs to furnish the people with these skills to go out and practice safely. So that's, I think that I would imagine will be the Q&I perspective generally. I'll bring it back to the team and discuss later.
Thank you, Agnes. That's great. Lovely. Thank you. Michelle, Midwives, have we got some questions for our colleagues?
Sorry, I forgot.
Hi. We've had one real sorry, I'll start again. We've had a selection of questions really around revalidation, especially for people who might have a primary registration as a midwife and then retrain as a health visitor or as a school nurse. How are they to revalidate when they've come through that route as a midwife?
Do you want to start off with this one?
Yeah, I can start. Hello, Michelle. I think some of this speaks to the history. When the order was first created back in 2021 and became our legislation, our statutory framework, at that time, everyone who was a midwife was also a nurse, and that continued for some years. So when those individuals went on to become SCPHN qualified, they were also, at that time, also nurses and midwives. Now, clearly with direct entry midwife, that's altered the landscape, and we have very distinct professions now where we have midwives who are not nurses and never have been a nurse. But a lot of those professionals who are eligible to do SCPHN are nurses and midwives, because that's the way that the legislation was written at the time, because that was the only thing. You could only be a midwife if you were also a nurse. So we looked at this in 2022 to see how many people are midwives only by virtue of their primary qualification. And one can see the relationship between that and health visiting in a quite straightforward way. And in relation to revalidation and their scope of practice, it's a bit more tricky, almost impossible, like one say, in relation to school nursing and occupational health nursing. So we think that some of those that the legislation doesn't prevent it, but revalidation would become very difficult to revalidate as a midwife by virtue only of using the SCPHN occupational health nursing standards. You would have to think about your scope of practice in relation to your primary registration as well. And so what we know is that a lot of people who are SCPHN qualified school nurse and SCPHN qualified occupational health nurse, they maintain their registration as a midwife in order to do the SCPHN, to maintain their SCPHN qualification as well. They could not maintain their registration as a SCPHN without maintaining their registration, their primary registration as a midwife. So they do have to make choices on whether the job, the employment role they're doing enables them to do that, or whether they have to undertake an additional role to maintain their primary registration. And just for illustrative purposes, we did have one recently who was a midwife who was working as a school nurse but hadn't done the SCPHN qualification. And we strongly advised that person to undertake some midwifery scope of practice, because they were a school nurse in an independent boys' school. So it would have been almost impossible to maintain their registration as a midwife by working in an independent boys' school as a school nurse. So it's very complicated. Yeah. And some of it is steeped in the history of the evolution of the order, and then when SCPHN qualifications were introduced, and then when midwifery became direct entry. But legislation currently permits midwives to apply for SCPHN programmes.
So do you think that might change?
In regulatory reform, it's one of those ones in the car park, I think, for Matthew and his team, that because we would need to look. We looked at that data back in 2021, 2020. So that data may have changed, because a lot of those professionals, I can say this because I'm one of those, are at, towards the end of their career. So they're getting a little bit older, shall we say. So it may be by the time the new legislation comes in that that would take care of it, shall we say, because they may not be on the register at all. But the other thing, and I'm sure Matthew will come in, and one of the reasons that reg reform is so important is that we cannot switch off some of our qualifications, as people know as well, our post-registration qualifications.
I think, thank you. I think it just actually demonstrates how important it is actually to start to do this regulatory reform. 2001 is such a long time ago, isn't it? I'm going to bring our health visiting colleague Amanda in. I think she's got a question for us.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. So we've had some questions coming in regarding titles of our health visiting teams. So in particular, some of our colleagues have the title of nursery nurse. Some have the title of health visiting staff nurse. So thinking about those titles moving forward, you know, could some of those titles be protected, or would this mean now that those sort of team members are unable to use a title nurse within the title of their current sort of role?
Thank you very much. Really important questions. And I've been following a little bit in the chat box some of the questions. And I think what all of this demonstrates to me is what a complicated issue this is, and how regulation is only part of the solution. Because no matter what we create, people will find a way around it if that's what they want to do. And so what we need to do, all of us on this call, but NMC in particular, is then work really closely with the system leaders and the employers, so that we can be really clear, actually, well, what are we trying to achieve here? I think it's, from my position at a regulator, which is only a partial view, I think it's quite important, as I've said, that, you know, people are really clear, if you're a member of the public, who's caring for you and what qualifications they've got. That's the angle I'm coming at it from. But if I were running a health and social care enterprise, whether it's in the NHS or in a local authority or private, whatever it happens to be, I would probably be coming at it from a very different lens, which is, I've got all of these people that we need to care for in various different settings. How do I staff that up in a way which enables people to get what they need? Qualifications are part of the answer, but not the sole answer, and therefore the incentives on me to create kind of job titles that I think, from my perspective, reflect actually what somebody's doing, but perhaps then as a regulator might say, well, maybe that's a bit confusing. I think those incentives exist, so we are going to need to get deeper into these conversations and really tease through what it means. And what we want to achieve and how we reach an accommodation on it, because I think the specific answer to your question is nursery nurses, as I understand it, very often are not registered nurses, and therefore they would not be able to call themselves nursery nurses in the future, because nurse is a title which is reserved only for people who've done a nursing qualification leading to registration with the NMC. So, you know, a lot of the other titles that people use in those sectors, early years workers and so on, those would all be absolutely fine, but nursery nurse not under the current proposals. Health visiting staff nurse is a really interesting one and a new one on me, and I'm probably not nearly as well placed as others on the call to know whether that's confusing or not. I think we would probably be saying it's one that we'd want to look at really carefully, because we've said health visitor is a protected title, we've set qualifications for health visiting, and nurse is also a protected title, so we'd want to look really carefully at, you know, is that something which potentially is confusing? But I think as we go through, there'll be loads of these things that are thrown up, and, you know, our primary angle on this is going to be with employers in the first instance, to try and get employers to bring clarity around some of these things. Sorry, not a terribly clear answer to your question, Amanda, but which I think probably signals the complexity of the issue rather than, well, it's certainly not from my perspective, isn't me trying to wriggle out of it. they're just quite complex questions.
Certainly does. I think it just, you know, this is the beginning of a very long conversation, and lots of thought to go further into this. Jill, just one other quick question, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
So just thinking about nurses who have the dual qualification of health visitor, Scuffin health visitor and Scuffin school nurse, will they be able to go onto the register under both of those titles? So 0 to 19, for example, health visitor, school nurse, that will be recordable.
Yeah, absolutely. People will be able, we will record whatever qualifications people have, and then they will be able to use those titles.
And that's obviously a difference to SCPHN now, as colleagues know, that their SCPHN qualification records their primary SCPHN field. And if they go on and undertake further qualifications, even it's through that, 10 to 12 week learning that historically a circular did. That was not on the SCPHN register. It was their initial SCPHN registration in their PIN. So that's an opportunity that opens up in the same way for the SPQ community nursing qualifications. So someone could become a community children's nurse with an NMC SPQ community children's nursing qualification, and they could go on and undertake the community learning disabilities nursing qualification, and we would identify both of these. And they may also do prescribing, so we would identify that as well. But that's not something that's available through the registration component as we have it just now.
So it does open up that transfer of fields in a way, more facilitates that more, or gives people some reward, I suppose, recognising that qualification at the end of that process. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Amanda. Sally Ann, have we got school nursing question?
Well, I think it sort of overlaps health visiting school nursing. It came through the chat, and I think links into that transfer fields of practice type scenario. It says, so the question was, if you have a health visitor qualification but are working as a school nurse or vice versa, would you need to complete additional training to be registered in that area and to be able to work in that area? And I think there's another bit, well, there's a bit that I want to tag on to that question that I think has come from perhaps independent nurses working in independent settings. So, and it says, so can we simply call ourselves a nurse in a school, or will everybody have to have a SCPHN qualification to work in a school?
If I kick off with that bit, and then maybe Anne come to you for the what qualifications are needed. But so again, this sort of comes back to the incentives in the system for different people and why the partnership working is going to be really key. As the NMC, we're not able to mandate employers to who they must employ in their organisations, whether that's nurses, midwives, nursing associates, or specialist qualifications of any kind. And so all we can do is say, you can't use a job title which is confusing with one of our qualifications or confusing. So, and this is where, you know, the sort of people getting around the protection that comes in, because there is nothing to say that if you are a nurse, currently a registered nurse, there's nothing to say that you wouldn't be able to work in a school under our proposals, but you wouldn't be able to call yourself a school nurse. So the question then is for the employer, what do I need in my institution? What are the skills that I need? Is it somebody who's a registered nurse who can provide care that looks like this, or do I actually need somebody with that advanced level of qualification, which is a school nurse? And you know, our powers can only go so far in saying, actually, you wouldn't be able to call yourself a school nurse if you don't have the qualification. It doesn't answer the question that the employer will have about, can I only employ somebody who has that qualification? And this is where the partnership working is going to be really crucial.
Really important. Yeah, thank you. I'm very conscious that time's moving on. Christina, have you got a question, another question from the Ocker Health nursing community? I think we might have lost Christina. Christina, I'm just going to move to Michelle, Midwives, and we'll come back to you if you join us. Michelle, have you another question from the midwife community?
No, I think most of the concerns are around revalidation.
Yeah,
so
and complexity of that. Thanks, Michelle.
Yes, thank you.
Agnes, anything specific from the Q&A? If not, I'll pop back to Amanda for health visiting.
I don't think so, Jill. I think you've covered everything. That's
lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Amanda, then over to you for the last question.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Jill. And I think this one is for Anne. So Anne, this is about third year nursing students. Would they be able to apply for the SCPHN course before receiving their PIN? I know there's been some news on this. And also, is there any news around possible direct entry to health visiting school nursing?
Okay, I'll answer the first one and bring Matthew in for the second one. As I mentioned earlier, standard 1.1 and the programme standards, the literal reading of it meant that people could not even recruit or select someone who was completing their pre-registration nursing or midwifery programme in order to select them for a place on the SCPHN programme. What we've done is change the wording to say that that recruitment and selection can take place while they're either completing their pre-registration programme or awaiting their PIN. But by the time they enrol on their programme, the university, the approved education institution, has to confirm that they are on the NMC register, either as a level 1 nurse or as a midwife. So that should enable some of those barriers that people were perceiving, particularly those areas that are seeking to attract the newly qualified individual into the SCPHN programme, that they have that option. But the safeguard that we're looking for relates to the lack of direct entry, because in order to become a SCPHN, you have to be either registered as a nurse level 1 or a midwife. But Matthew, I'll hand over direct entry and hopefully come back if that's needed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Amanda, for the question. So, I mean, at the moment, we don't regulate any of the post-registration qualifications, health visiting, school nursing, or any of them as direct entry. And when we've engaged across the 4 nations on the strategies that the system leaders are driving forward, we haven't detected within those any strong desire at this point to move towards direct entry. And so the question for us has really been, can we regulate for what we currently do and what we understand of the future landscape using the powers that we will get from the department? And the answer to that is yes, and therefore we're planning at the moment to move to a model which retains direct entry only for nursing, midwifery and nursing associates. That isn't to say direct entry wouldn't never be an option in the future, because anything is possible, isn't it? But it would require, kind of firm intentions, firm plans, firm evidence, and a strong desire to move towards that in order for the department to be persuaded that there was a case to change from the current approach. And at the moment, that isn't there. So that's not what we're working towards.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Committed the worst sin, haven't I, talking whilst on mute? Thank you for that. I think that has been a key kind of conversation that's been going round and round. Can I say thank you to yourself, Matthew and Anne? It's been absolutely fabulous to have you with us for so long and giving your views, your updates, I think it's been really, really valuable to all the people who've attended the webinar, and it is being recorded so people were able to look afterwards. I'm very aware that we will have had questions that won't have been answered, and I think you do have FAQs, so I think the best thing we can do is to kind of summarise what we have and make sure that you get those and you can incorporate those in your FAQs going forward if that's okay. Lovely, thank you. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jane Beach from Unite, and she's going to kind of give us a bit of a summary of the session and another opportunity for you to give your views. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Jill. Well, it's quite difficult to sum that up, really. It's a very complex topic, isn't it? And I think as ever, when you start on these sessions, you have questions, and then, it brings up more questions. I think regulatory reform has been in the offing since I started at Unite, which is nearly 12 years ago. So it's been a long process, but it does feel that we are getting somewhere. Unite CPHVA for a long time was saying that the SCPHN register wasn't particularly working, as other organisations did too. So it's really positive to see that there is some movement. really encouraging to hear the plans around protected titles and qualifications, but I think it's, you know, it's been really helpful today that some other areas, sorry, I think somebody needs to mute if that's possible, thank you. There are still areas that, you know, unintended consequences that really need to be you know, brought to the fore and looked at. So I think there's a lot still to work through, and it'll be really interesting to see how that does work through. It's really important. I mean, thank you all for presenting today. Thank you to the RCN for hosting, and to all of my colleagues. It's been, you know, amazing to work with you on this. I think it's really important we all work together on it. But thank you all for joining and for listening and sending in your questions. It's really important to be involved in this going forward, because we need your input into this. The NMC need your input into it, because, you know, there are lots of things that, you know, we don't know and would be really useful to know. So it's a real opportunity to influence what happens going forward in regulatory reform, and really ensure that the public are protected, and also, you know, that the professions are in a good place too. So please do be involved and stay in touch with your membership organisation. You know, we all have plans and you know, resources going forward, and we will be taking this work forward together with you. So thank you for your time, and please keep, you know, sending in your questions and contributing to this really important piece of work. We have a final poll now, so if you want to get your cameras out and put them up against the QR code and tell us what's worked well today, you know, whether you do feel that you are a little bit more informed. We're not expecting you to be completely informed, because we've been working in this area for a long time, and there's still a lot of questions that we have. So but as I say, you know, keep your eye out. It won't be your last opportunity. This is very much work in progress. So thank you all for joining. Back over to you, I think, Jill.
Thank you, Jane. You'll see there's the QR code then leading you to what worked well today, and what more you would want from us, and also how much your knowledge of the topic has increased. So please do complete that. I'm assuming that will go on in the background. Can I say thank you again to all my colleagues from the different professional organisations. It's been really very helpful and interesting and exciting to work together, and to provide our colleagues out there in practice with some information and some answers to their questions. But as you said, Jen, there will be more. And thank you again to Matthew and to Anne from the NMC. I will now close this webinar. Do please keep in touch. We will be looking at your questions. If we haven't answered them, we will be making sure we give those to the NMC, and they'll go on their website as their FAQs. Thank you again, everybody. Enjoy your afternoon, and may I say goodbye.